The general store locked its door in her face at 4:30, and Cora didn't even have the energy to knock. She stood on the warped pine boards of the porch, one hand gripping the post to keep herself upright, skissed, and watched the lamplight inside wink out. The woman behind the glass didn't look at her. She'd just pulled the shade down, slow and deliberate, the way you'd close your eyes on something you didn't want to remember seeing. The wind came off the ridgeline and hit Cora full in the chest. It smelled of pine resin and oncoming snow, the kind of cold that didn't just chill the skin but climbed inside the joints and settled there. She pulled what remained of her coat tighter. The left button was gone. She'd lost it somewhere on the trail 2 days back, and hadn't had the wherewithal to care. Decker's Hollow wasn't much of a town. One street, half the storefronts shuttered for winter, a livery that smelled of sick horses. She'd walked in off the mountain road that morning, thinking she'd find work, or at minimum a meal she could trade labor for. What she'd found instead was a postmaster who told her the next supply wagon wasn't coming until March, and a woman at the rooming house who looked at her cracked boots and her road-filthy hair, and told her the rooms were full. The rooms were not full. Cora had counted 2 lit windows in the whole building. She pressed her back against the porch post and looked down the length of the street. The sky above the peaks was turning a bruised, greenish gray that meant the snow wasn't coming tomorrow. It was coming tonight. She had 4 cents in her coat pocket. She had a wedding ring she'd already tried to sell at the assay office, who'd told her it wasn't gold, which she'd suspected but hadn't been ready to hear confirmed. She had a small leather satchel with a change of underclothes and a tin-tip photograph of her mother that she'd stopped looking at because it made her chest hurt. That was the total sum of Cora's life at 26 years old. A freight wagon rolled slowly up the far end of the street. The draft horse pulling it was enormous, a dark roan with heavy feathering at the fetlocks, blowing white plumes of breath into the cold air. The man driving it was larger. He sat on the bench like he'd been carved out of the same mountain behind him, broad across the shoulders, a flat-brimmed hat pulled low over a face that was mostly dark beard and hard angles. He didn't look left or right. He guided the horse to the front of the feed store, set the brake, and climbed down in one slow, unhurried movement. Cora watched him haul a sack of oats off the wagon bed and set it against the feed store door, which was also locked. He didn't appear to find this surprising. He simply pulled a folded paper from his coat, tucked it under the door, and turned back to the wagon. That was when he saw her. He didn't react the way men usually reacted to a woman, standing alone on a dark street in a failing coat. He didn't slow his walk or alter his expression. He just looked at her, one flat assessing sweep, the way you'd look at the sky to gauge weather. He went back to the wagon, checked the lashing on the tarp, and walked to the horse's head to check the bit. Cora's stomach cramped. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. A heel of bread she'd found in her satchel, dry as sawdust. She pressed her fist against her ribs and told herself it didn't matter. The man unhitched the water bucket from the side of the wagon and carried it to the trough at the edge of the road. He stood there while the horse drank, one hand resting on the animal's neck, not impatiently but with the steady patience of someone for whom time moved differently than it did for other people. The first snowflakes came. Not the soft, picturesque kind, the mean, horizontal kind that stung when they hit bare skin. Cora's jaw had been clenched for so long the muscle below her ear was aching. She unclenched it. She made herself breathe through her nose. She was not going to cry on a public street in a town where no one would help her anyway. She pushed off the post and took 3 steps toward the wagon before she could talk herself out of it. "Excuse me." The man looked up from the water bucket. His eyes, in the failing light, were a dark, unreadable gray. "I'm sorry to bother you." The words felt brittle in her throat. She'd been raised not to ask for things. She'd spent 6 years in a marriage that reinforced that particular lesson. "I'm looking for work." Or, she stopped. started again. I need somewhere to be tonight. Out of the weather, I can work for it. I can cook, or clean, or... She stopped because he was looking at her the same way he'd looked at the locked feed store, not unkindly, not kindly either, simply looking. I don't have money, she said, because there was no point in the pretense. I have 4 cents and a wedding ring that turns out to be tin. The wind threw a fistful of snow sideways between them. The man reached down and picked up the water bucket. He hung it back on the side of the wagon. He walked around to the driver's side, stepped up onto the bench, and gathered the reins. Cora's stomach dropped. Get in the back, he said. His voice was low, rough, like a door that hadn't been opened in a while. Or don't, up to you. He said it the same way he'd said everything, which was without any particular investment in the outcome. Cora thought about the rooming house with its 2 lit windows. She thought about the alley behind the assay office, which had no roof and was filling up with snow. She walked to the back of the wagon, found the iron step, and climbed in. The wagon bed had a canvas stretched over iron bows. It kept out the worst of the snow, but not the cold. Cora huddled in the corner between a crate of dry goods and a coil of rope and watched the dark shapes of the pine trees slide past. The man drove without speaking. She couldn't see his face from where she sat, only the back of his coat and the rigid set of his shoulders. She didn't ask where they were going. She figured she'd find out when they got there, and whatever it was would be warmer than Decker's Hollow. The horse pulled them up a grade that made the wagon creak and lean. The snow was falling harder now, the flakes fat and fast, and the trees pressing in on both sides of the track were bowed heavy with it. The dark came on complete. No moon, no stars, just the small swinging lantern on the side of the wagon throwing a circle of yellow light against the falling white. Cora's feet had gone numb somewhere around the first mile. She wiggled her toes inside her boots and felt nothing. She tucked her hands under her arms and stared at the back of the stranger's coat and tried not to think about how cold the wagon bed was, or how long the road was, or how deeply, profoundly stupid this choice might have been. She had her hand around the small pocket knife in her coat pocket. Useless, probably, but it was hers. The horse stopped. Cora heard the man climb down, heard his boots in snow, heard a door latch lift. "Can you walk?" he called. She tried to stand and her knees buckled sideways. She grabbed the side of the wagon and held on. "No," she said, which was the most humiliating single syllable she had ever produced. He appeared at the back of the wagon, dropped the tailgate, and looked at her in the lamplight. He didn't sigh. He didn't make a face. He reached in, wrapped one arm around her back, and got the other under her knees, and lifted her out of the wagon like she weighed nothing, which, given how little she'd eaten in the past week, was probably closer to the truth than she liked. He carried her up 2 porch steps and through a door into darkness that smelled of cold ash and pine resin and something else underneath, something animal and warm. He set her down in a chair. She felt the ladder back rails against her spine, and left her there. She heard him moving in the dark, heard a match strike, saw the flare of a flame touching tinder. The fire caught slowly, then with confidence. The hearth threw orange light across the room, and Cora looked around at rough log walls, a narrow bed in the far corner. Shelves dense with jars and tools and things she couldn't name. A single oil lamp on the table, one of everything, one chair, one plate on the shelf, one coat hook by the door with one coat on it, not counting the one he was currently wearing. The man knelt at the hearth, feeding the fire with a steady, economical hand. He hadn't looked at her since he put her down. "Boots off," he said. Cora bent forward and reached for her laces. Her fingers were clumsy, half frozen, and the knots had tightened in the wet cold. She picked at them for a long, humiliating minute before he turned from the fire, came to her, and crouched down. He didn't ask. He simply moved her hands out of the way and worked the knots loose himself, pulling the soaked leather from her feet with the brisk efficiency of a man who had done practical things his entire life and didn't attach sentiment to any of them. He peeled off her wet stockings too, and Cora stared at the top of his hat and felt her face go hot. "Don't move them close to the fire," he said, setting her boots by the door. "Thaw them slow." He looked at her bare feet, the skin a mottled greyish-white. His jaw tightened slightly, the only indication of any feeling. "It'll hurt when the feeling comes back." He stood, walked to the shelves, and started pulling things down. She heard the clank of an iron pot, the scrape of a lid. "I said I could cook," Cora offered. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "Hands aren't unkind yet." He didn't say it he said it like a diagnosis. "Sit." She sat. He put beans on and cut salt pork into a heavy skillet. The smell hit Cora so hard she had to close her eyes. Her stomach seized up, a violent hollow cramping that she clenched her jaw against and refused to acknowledge out loud. He moved around the small cabin with no wasted motion. She watched him. She watched his hands. Specifically, the way she always watched men's hands. Hands now, cat-logging the way they moved, whether they moved fast or slow, whether they moved toward things or away. His moved steadily, purposefully, without the sudden changes in direction that she'd learned to brace for. His hands were scarred. The back of the right one had a long, pale ridge running toward the wrist. The left had 2 fingers that sat slightly crooked, healed from a break a long time back. He set a tin plate on her lap without ceremony. Salt pork and some kind of pan bread, both burned slightly on the bottom, in a way that didn't matter at all. He took his own plate and sat on a stool on the other side of the hearth. Cora ate. She didn't mean to eat the way she did. She'd intended to take small bites and be grateful quietly, and maintain whatever was left of her dignity. What actually happened was that the first bite touched her tongue, and the animal part of her took over completely, and she ate fast and wordlessly and efficiently until the plate was clean. And then she sat there with her chin down, her face burning, aware that she'd just licked the bread grease off her own fingers in front of a stranger. She looked up. He was watching her, not with disgust, not with anything she could easily name, just watching. "I'm sorry," she said. "I haven't. It's been a while since I—" "Nothing to apologize for," he said. He looked back at his own plate. "Being hungry's not a character flaw." The fire cracked. The wind hit the side of the cabin and passed on. Cora set her empty plate on the floor and looked at the single narrow bed against the far wall and felt the specific kind of dread that she'd been carrying for 3 years settle back into her chest like a stone returning to its pocket. The man stood. He walked to the cedar chest at the foot of the bed and pulled out a heavy quilt, patchwork and worn. The colors faded to softness. He carried it to her and dropped it in her lap. "Chair," he said, "or the floor by the hearth. Floor's harder, but it stays warmer." Cora blinked. "And you?" He pointed at the bed. "My bed." He said it without emphasis. Just the fact of it. "Where?" She stopped. "Right." "Yes." She looked at the quilt in her lap. "Thank you." He blew out the lamp. The dark came on dense, the fire the only light, and Cora heard him cross to the bed, heard the rope springs take his weight. She pulled the quilt around herself in the chair, curled her bare feet up under her, and listened to the wind. He didn't touch her. He didn't say anything else. He just breathed, slow and even. And eventually the breathing deepened and she realized he was asleep, just like that, with no apparent concern about the stranger in his chair. Cora sat in the dark for a long time. Then she cried, very quietly, into the quilt. Not from fear. From the terrible, disorienting relief of being indoors. His name, she found out the next morning, was Fen. He told her with his back to her, in the same tone he might use to report the weather. He was at the table sharpening a knife when she woke up, and he said, "Coffee's on," and then, a minute later, without any lead in, "Name's Fen," and that was the entirety of the introduction. "Cora," she said, wrapping her hands around the tin mug. He nodded. He went back to his knife. The day was brilliant outside. The storm had packed itself in overnight and left the world buried and blinding. The snow was deep against the base of the porch, and the sky had gone that particular hard blue that only happens at elevation when the air is cold enough to crack. Cora looked around the cabin in daylight and took a proper inventory. It was spare in the way that things become spare when there's no one else to accumulate for. One of everything, like she'd noticed, but everything was in good repair. The shelves were neat. The hearth was clean. Whoever Fen was, he wasn't a man who let things fall apart. "Is there work I can do?" she asked. He looked at her feet, still mottled and tender from the night before. "Not yet," she almost argued. She stopped herself. She drank the coffee, which was brutally strong and tasted of char, and she was grateful for every sip. The second day the cold hit her. It didn't announce itself. It started as a low-grade ache in the back of her skull, and a general feeling of the floor shifting slightly when she stood up. By mid-morning it had settled into her chest, a deep, wet heaviness that made each breath feel slightly smaller than the last. She tried not to cough. She lasted until noon. When the coughing started, Fen stopped what he was doing. He'd been mending a harness on the floor near the stove, and sat very still for a moment. Then he set the harness down. He came to where she was sitting in the chair and pressed the back of his hand to her forehead without asking. His hand was rough and cool against her skin. He muttered something she didn't catch. "I'm fine," she said. Her voice was a wreck. He gave her a look that communicated, without any particular drama, that he had not asked for her assessment. He put willow bark tea on the fire and made her drink all of it, holding the cup steady until she had. It tasted like chewing on a riverbank, bitter and mineral and absolutely medicinal. She gagged through it. He waited it out. "Bed?" he said. "It's your bed. I'm aware." He picked up the quilt from the chair and carried it to the cot. "I've slept on the floor before. Get in." She was too tired to fight it. The fever was already making the edges of things soft and uncertain, and he pulled the heavy bear hide up over her. She was asleep before she could form another objection. She dreamed about Thomas. Not the Thomas from the beginning, the one who'd had kind eyes and a good laugh and had told her father he'd take care of her. She dreamed about the Thomas from later, the one who came home from a bad month at the sawmill and looked for something smaller than himself to make the feeling stop. She dreamed about the way he could smile in public and the way his expression changed when the door closed behind them. She woke up thrashing. Strong hands caught her wrists, not tight, just firm. "Anchoring. Easy," Fen said, from somewhere nearby in the dark. Cora went still. She was soaked with sweat. The bare hide was half on the floor. The fire had burned low, and in its dim orange light she could see Fen sitting on an upturned crate beside the cot, a bowl of water in his lap. He dipped a cloth in the water and wrung it out. He pressed it to her forehead. The cold of it pulled a soft, involuntary sound from her throat. She moved her head. The collar of her dress slipped sideways. She saw his hand stop. In the firelight, the bruising on her collarbone was old but visible. The yellowing remains of fingers pressed too deep, spread wide, overlapping. The kind of mark that took a specific intention to leave. The silence in the room changed. Fen's jaw set. He looked at the bruising for a long moment, then looked at the fire. He didn't ask. He dipped the cloth again. He moved it to the side of her neck, carefully, nowhere near the bruises. His touch was impersonal and deliberate, and somehow that was the most devastating thing she had experienced in recent memory, a man choosing, with full awareness, to be careful with her. Cora pulled the bear hide up to her chin. "Fever's working down," Fen said quietly. "Sleep." He sat in the dark beside the cot for a long time. She could feel him there, not hovering, not watching her in the way she'd learned to dread being watched, but just present. A fixed point. When she drifted back under, she did it without fear, which was something she had not been able to say in a long while. The fever broke the next morning, leaving her wrung out and hollow and very, very hungry. Fen made eggs. She didn't ask where eggs came from. She could hear chickens somewhere outside now that the storm was over, and she ate 2 plates of them, and he let her without comment. They fell into a quiet after that, a rhythm. The snow kept them in for another week. It wasn't comfortable, exactly. The cabin was small, and Fen was not a man who filled silence with noise, and there were hours where the only sounds were the fire and the wind and the scratch of whatever he was working on. But Cora found, slowly, that the silence didn't scare her the way it used to. At home, silence had meant something was building. Here it was just quiet. She started cooking on the third day. When her hands had warmed back to something functional, she made mistakes. Put the salt in twice on the beans, scorched the first pan of cornbread, and Fen ate whatever she made without visible complaint. Once, when she burned the biscuits entirely and apologized, he looked at the blackened discs on the plate and said, "I've eaten worse," and she believed him. He showed her things without making them into lessons. How to bank the fire so it held heat through the night. How to tell if the weather was shifting by watching the ridgeline. Where the snowshoes were hung in case she needed to get to the woodshed and back. He talked to her in the way. He did everything, economically, when there was something that needed saying and not before. One evening she asked him how long he'd been up here. He thought about it. 7 years, give or take. Alone? Mostly. He was cleaning the rifle, a careful and practiced routine. Had a dog for 4 years. She died last winter. I'm sorry. He nodded. He kept cleaning the gun. Don't you want to go back? She asked. Somewhere easier. He looked up from the barrel. The oil lamp caught the grey in his eyes. Easier than what? He said. She didn't have an answer for that. He set the cleaning rod down. He looked at the lamp for a moment, and then at his own hands. I had a partner, he said. Logging camp, down in the valley, 8 years ago. He paused. Things went bad. A man died that didn't need to. I couldn't prove what I knew, and I couldn't stay where I knew it. He picked up the cleaning rod again. Up here, things are what they are, he said. Snow is snow, cold is cold. Nothing pretends to be something it isn't. Cora looked at her own hands around her mug, the calluses forming, new ones, in different places than before. His name was Thomas, she said, and she was surprised to hear herself say it, because she hadn't planned to. Fen didn't move. My husband. She looked at the fire. I thought I could manage it. I thought if I was good enough, or quiet enough, or useful enough. She stopped, started again. I stopped thinking that eventually. She reached up, the familiar unconscious gesture, and touched the base of her throat. Fen watched her hand. He said nothing. I took the cash out of his desk, she said. $60. I waited until he was in town. I packed 1 bag, and I walked to the road, and I got on the first coach heading north. She exhaled. I didn't know where it was going. I just needed it to go. The fire shifted. Fen was quiet for a long time. Is he looking for you? He asked finally. I don't know. He might. She felt the cold, familiar spike of it. He has money. He has connections. Fen nodded slowly. Pass won't clear till April. He set the rifle on the table. Stock first. No one's coming up this canyon while there's 12 feet of snow on it. He paused. And if someone does come looking in the spring, they've got to come up the same trail. He looked at her steadily. I know every foot of that trail, he said, and I know every place on it a man can be turned around. It wasn't a dramatic declaration. He said it, the way he said everything, flat and certain. The way you'd state a fact about geography. But Cora felt it settle into her chest like a coal against the coal. She looked at the mug in her hands. Why are you doing this? She asked. You don't know me. I showed up in your wagon without being asked. Fen was quiet for a moment. Then, you got into a stranger's wagon in a snowstorm rather than lie down in an alley. He looked at the table. That's not stupidity. That's somebody who's not finished yet. He stood up. I'm going to check the horse, he said, and went out. Cora sat alone in the warm cabin and stared at the fire for a long time. The thaw came the way spring always comes at elevation, in arguments. 1 warm day, then a brutal cold snap, then 2 warm days, then ice, then finally a sustained stretch of sun. That meant what it said. The snow on the south-facing slopes went first. The creek behind the cabin came back to life. loud and cold and brown with snowmelt. Cora learned to make decent pan bread. She learned to read the wind. She learned that Fen took his coffee with nothing in it, and ate everything she cooked without comment. Except once, when she made a stew from the rabbit he'd snared, and something in the spicing was right, and he looked at the bowl and said, "This is good," with the gravity of a man issuing a legal document. She treasured it more than she wanted to admit. She learned that he limped slightly on cold mornings, his right knee stiff from something that had happened before she knew him. She learned that he read at night, not books, but an old almanac that he seemed to have memorized, running his finger along the columns of planting dates and weather patterns. She learned that he fed the chickens before he fed himself, and that he talked to the horse, briefly, in a voice too low for her to hear the words. She learned that she was no longer afraid of the dark. One morning in March, she was at the window watching Fen in the yard. He was splitting wood, the axe rising and falling in a steady rhythm, the split pieces flying clean. The horse was in the paddock behind him, moving slow in the thin winter sun. She was not watching him the way she used to watch men. She was watching him the way you watch something reliable. Something you've built enough evidence about to trust. It surprised her, the noticing of it. When he came inside, stomping the mud off his boots, she poured his coffee and handed it to him without being asked. He took it. Their fingers didn't touch. He sat at the table and she sat across from him, and she said, "I want to stay." He looked up from the mug. "When the pass clears," she said, "I want to stay here. If there's work enough for two, and you can tolerate a person who is still learning to not burn the biscuits." She kept her voice level, and she was determined to say it plainly, and without pleading, because she was done with pleading for things. "I'm not asking for anything except the chance to be useful. I learn fast when I'm not afraid." Fen looked at her for a long time, long enough that she almost filled the silence which she'd learned not to do with him, because he thought at the pace he wanted and not before. He set his mug down. "You'd need to know how to use a rifle," he said. "If something comes up when I'm out at the traps, you'd have to teach me. I'd have to teach you," he agreed. He turned his mug in his hands. "Can't promise piano music," he said, "or silk, or easy winters. I know, place is small." He looked around at the cabin. "We'd be in each other's way considerable. I know." He was quiet again. Outside, a chunk of snow fell off the eave and hit the porch with a soft thud. The creek was running hard. "There's a second pair of snowshoes in the shed," Fen said finally. "Too small for me," were the previous owners. He looked at her. "I kept them," he said. "Didn't know why." Something in Cora's chest went very still, and then very warm, all at once. She didn't throw her arms around him. She didn't cry. She reached across the table and put her hand flat on the rough wood between them, and he looked at it for a moment, and then he reached out and put his hand over hers. And that was all. They stayed like that for a while. Then he stood up, picked up his coffee, and walked toward the door. "Ground's soft enough to put in a kitchen garden," he said, pulling his coat off the hook. "If you know anything about that, I know a little," Cora said. "I can learn more." Fen opened the door. The morning light came in cold and sharp and clean, carrying the smell of pine and snowmelt, and the particular quality of air at elevation in spring, the sense of something locked open at last. He looked back at her over his shoulder. "Well," he said, "then let's get started."